Are there errors in your Form 26 AS and Annual Information Statement? Here's what to do. Welcome to TUI Wallet Talks. As you sit down to file your tax return this year, it's important to look out for possible errors in the Annual Information Statement and Form 26 AS. What are these errors and how can you as a taxpayer get them rectified? Preeti Sharma of BDO India explains all this in the video. Welcome to the show, Preeti. So, we are going to start today by understanding what Form 26 AS is, what is Annual Information Statement, what do they reflect for me, and how has the AIS actually evolved over the last 2-3 years?
As you know, the government is focusing completely on use of technology to enhance the taxpayer experience.
Yes.
And a pre-filled tax return is basically top on the agenda for individual taxpayers. Towards that step, what government had started doing is to collect that data from different sources. It may be your employer, your bank, your depository participant. If you get into any property transaction, sale or purchase of transaction, that is sourced. If you are dealing in foreign exchange, all that information is sourced by the government. Download Form 26 AS and AIS, and then you can see all the information which is captured there. Let's first talk about Form 26 AS. In Form 26 AS, you will find all the information related to different type of tax payments, such as TDS, if you are a salaried employee, your salary and the tax deducted by your employer is reflecting in that. Similarly, if the bank has deducted tax from your interest income, that will also be reflecting there. In a foreign exchange transaction, if there is a tax collected at source. Similarly, if you are purchasing a vehicle and immovable property transaction, if there is a tax collected at source, that will also reflect in Form 26 AS. Over and above, whatever tax you have deposited as a self-assessment tax, advance tax, you will find all that information there.
Right.
Now, AIS is a kind of extension to Form 26 AS. Apart from the information which is there in Form 26 AS, AIS has many more information points captured there, like all your capital gain transactions. Like if you are dealing in your shares, selling or purchasing mutual funds, all those transactions will be there. Similarly, dividend declared by the companies, all interest on your saving bank account, fixed deposits, all that will be captured in your AIS statement. And similarly, all your foreign exchange transactions, you will find that in your AIS statement. What government does, that they capture all the data, whatever is there in their database that's sitting in AIS. And when you log into your account, you will say in AIS section 2 statements. One is AIS and other is TIS. Now, TIS is basically from AIS, government basically use the technology to remove duplicate transactions. And then that process data is sitting in TIS. Okay. Whatever data is there in TIS, that's going in your income tax return.
Okay, right? What's TIS?
This is the tax information statement, which is a part of AIS. So when you log into your account and go to AIS section, you will see 2 statements. One is tax information statement and another is annual information statement.
Okay.
So whatever there in tax information statement, that is captured in your pre-filled tax return.
Okay.
Right? So when you're filing your tax returns, it is very important that you download these statements, look at each and every entry and validate that. Because if that information is not accurate, if that information doesn't belong to you, then you will not capture that in your income tax return. And when the government or the income tax department reconcile your tax return with these statements, there will be a deviation. And in that situation, expect a notice from tax department.
Okay, and what are the kind of typical errors that can get thrown out or discrepancies in the annual information statement?
Okay, let's first talk about Form 26 AS. And you have to be very careful, because in case there is an error in Form 26 AS, government is simply reconciling or comparing that with the data which is there in income tax return. And in case there is a deviation, you will immediately receive a notice to provide the explanation for the deviation. Some typical errors that you see is basically if you're a salaried employee, your monthly salary is not accurately captured. So whatever salary you have received, that may not be equal to what is reported in Form 26 AS. The employer has already deducted certain amount of tax, but then after deduction of monthly tax, employer has to report that in its quarterly TDS returns, right? And that whatever information reported in that quarterly TDS return will reflect in your Form 26 AS. So in case there is any error made by the employer while reporting or filing Form 24Q, which is the quarterly TDS return, that error will reflect in your 26 AS. And in case you feel that all the TDS is not reflecting, there is a mistake in the salary, what is mentioned in 26 AS, please immediately raise it with your employer and request them to rectify that error. So that is a common mistake. But apart from that, the bank is also deducting TDS on your interest income. And then sometime it happens that when you've downloaded your Form 26 AS, by that time the bank has not filed the TDS return. And that's why those transactions are not reflecting in your Form 26 AS. Or there is some mistake or error done by bank while filing the. The third type of mistake which can be made by the taxpayer also, when you're depositing your advance tax, you have selected a wrong financial year, because there is always a confusion that what is financial year, what is assessment year, and then a common man while depositing taxes sometimes select assessment year instead of financial year.
Okay, and what about the kind of discrepancies that could possibly get thrown up in your AIS?
Right. Very interesting questions, and I'll say there are two types of discrepancies. One is the error in the information that belongs to you.
Okay.
Right. So whatever is error in 26 AS, the same errors will replicate in AIS as well. Right. But then I'll give you a classic example that you have sold a immovable property. And then the property is jointly held with the other owners as well, but you are a primary owner. So the entire transaction may appear against your PAN in your AIS. However, as you are a joint holder of the property, the entire sale consideration doesn't belong to you.
Yes.
So that's basically maybe you may have got a lower amount of money in your hand, but much higher consideration is reflecting in your AIS.
Yes.
Right. Similarly, AIS also captures the capital gain transactions. So whatever shares, mutual funds you have sold during the year, the AIS will calculate the capital gain on all the transactions. And then the government will source that data from your depository participant. So if you have a demat account with ICICI Direct will share the data with the government. Now, while calculating that capital gain, the cost of acquisition may not be accurately captured, because if you purchased some shares in the past and you're selling it now, the government may not have the data of the purchase price of those shares in the past. Right. And then that may not be accurately captured. So the actual capital gain may be different than what is reflecting in AIS. Right? These are some common errors for the information that belongs to you. But what many taxpayers are facing, that there are few data points or information captured in AIS that actually doesn't belong to you. Okay. Right? So I've heard that few people have downloaded AIS and then realized that there's a huge amount of foreign exchange remittance appearing in AIS, but they haven't done so. Right? Similarly, there is a amount of capital gain transactions appearing, and that doesn't belong to them. And that is because your PAN number is inaccurately, erroneously reported by the agency who is sharing that data with the government.
Okay.
So you may have not done that exchange control or foreign exchange transaction, but the bank has reported your PAN. When you get into agreement with your tenant, you give the rent receipt to the tenant. Tenant is claiming HRA exemption, right? And in order to claim HRA exemption, the tenant has to share the PAN number of landlord with the employer.
Yes.
Employer reports that PAN number in the quarterly TDS return that employer is filing, and government is sourcing that data. And because your PAN is reported against a rent paid by tenant, it is reflecting in your AIS. And sometimes what people do that they report wrong PAN numbers to the employers, and if someone has reported your PAN with the employer, although you have not received the rent, that may reflect in your AIS.
Okay. And what if there is any error in my Form 16? How do I get that rectified?
So if there is an error in Form 16, which is issued by your employer, or error in Form 16A, which is issued by the bank or whosoever is making you the payment and deducting TDS, you have to approach your employer or the person who has deducted the tax and ask them to rectify their TDS return. And that's how you can get it rectified. So Form 26, and all these errors will reflect in your Form 26 AS. So once the deductor rectify those mistakes, that will correctly reflect in your Form 26 AS, and then the person has to issue you the revised Form 16.
Those discrepancies and possible errors that we spoke of for the annual information statement, what is my grievance redressal mechanism? How do I raise it with the income tax department?
Till last year, it was very difficult, but now there is a new feature which was introduced by tax department in AIS statement in January, where for each AIS transaction, you can raise the query online. And if you feel it doesn't belong to you, you can mention that. If you feel the amount is incorrect, you can mention that. So now there is a formal mechanism to dispute any wrong reporting in AIS. So you simply go to your account, go to AIS section, and for each transaction, you have an option to raise query. So if something doesn't belong to you, immediately raise the query and then mention that in the AIS statement. The AIS statement will generate a log and which captures all your concern. And the clear advantage is because if a transaction doesn't belong to you, you will not report that in your income tax return. There is going to be a deviation between AIS and your income tax return. While the tax officer is looking at this deviation, if you have raised the query, he will know the reason of deviation, right? And he may not issue you a notice asking for clarification. Yeah, if that reason is accurately captured in your query. So in that way, you will avoid the hassle of receiving notices from the tax department on those wrong entries in your AIS.
In the meantime, do you recommend that I go ahead and file my tax return? For example, there may be a huge tax demand that may be raised in my name.
Compare the transactions which are mentioned in Form 26 AS with your income tax return.
Right.
In case there is a deviation, then you expect a tax demand notice, and that's why it is so important to get those rectified.
Right.
The moment you raise the request with the bank or with your employer, as a next step, they have to go and revise their TDS return. So it all depends on the frequency when they're revising their TDS returns. But I have seen that in case there is a mistake, if you approach your employer, and especially banks, they will proactively go ahead and revise the return. And then the transaction will accurately reflect in 26 AS. But then, even if it is not reflecting accurately, you have raised the request, I suggest that file the return within the due date, because if you don't file it, then you have to pay the penalty and interest for delaying filing. So we really don't want that additional financial burden on us. AIS will not raise additional demand on you. Whatever transactions are there in 26 AS, that's critical for comparison with income tax return. All additional financial transactions which are there in AIS, now the tax officer will use that statement to see that whether the details reported in your income tax returns are accurate or not. Okay. And in case you feel that there is a mistake in AIS, that's the reason I'm recommending to immediately raise the query. because
Okay.
then when that comparison is happening, at least the tax department has the sufficient information in the record that why there is a deviation in tax return and AIR.